concept that Pesach is considered to be the birthday of the people of Israel, the Jewish people. And the Medrash says a fascinating concept that when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, is as if they were a fetus in the womb of a pregnant woman, which it eats what its mother eats, it drinks what its mother drinks, it breathes what its mother breathes. And the reason that a birthday is so important is because a birthday grants independence to the fetus. The child become an independent entity, even though they're still dependent on their mother for the nutrients and for the health, but basically they're a standalone entity. And therefore, in the Haggadah, on the night of Pesach, we quote what it says, that God took a nation from within a nation because the Israelites were swallowed in. So the independence of the Jewish people and the people of Israel, which is actually their birthday, is on the night of Pesach. So that in itself tells you why it's so special. So it's more than just the day of liberation. It's more than a day that someone was incarcerated, they had a day of liberation. It's birthing. They become a new entity, an independent entity. They became an entity where they're a nation unto Hashem. So that in itself tells us that Pesach, the holiday of Passover, is very significant and very important. Another way that we know that Pesach is very significant and very important is that the first mitzvot, the first commandments that were given to the Jewish people as a people, revolved around Pesach. The first mitzvah was Rosh Chodesh, and to declare the month of Nisan, which we currently are in, as the main month, as the head of all the other months of the year. It's the month that leads all the other months of the year. So even though Rosh Hashanah is on Tishrei, but the birthday of the Jewish people is on Nisan, that's why it becomes the main month for the Jewish people, is the month of Nisan. Then the other laws of Pesach, for instance, the bringing of the Paschal lamb, the eating of the Matzah, the eating of the bitter herbs, all of that, all of those mitzvahs were given to the Jewish people while they were still in Egypt in preparation for the holiday of Pesach. So if you look on the first commandments that were handed down to the Bnei Israel, it's all about Pesach. So, number one, Pesach is 2 nights in a row. That's great. Okay. You're forgiven for that. So, number one is the birthday of the Jewish people. And number two, the first commandments that were given to the Jewish people were given in regards to Pesach. To have a Seder, to eat matzah, to have bitter herbs, and to celebrate their freedom. And they were supposed to take the blood of the sacrifice and put it on the doorpost. And then when the angel of death came to smite all the firstborn, it passed over or leaped over the homes of the Jewish people that were observing the Paschal lamb and observing the Paschal holiday, which is Pesach, and they were spared from death. Thus the name is called Pesach. And the korban, the offering that was brought, was the korban Pesach, because God leaped over the Jewish homes. So that in itself tells you that Pesach is a very, very significant time. So being that Pesach is a very significant time, we should have a big celebration, which we do. However, here's the caveat. God not throws in, but designates Pesach in a very unique way and says that for the 7 days of Pesach, you're not permitted to eat any chametz, which is leavened bread or anything that is on the level of leaven. Not only are you not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to have it in your possession, and you're not allowed to see it. You're not allowed to have any connection to chametz. A very strict law. And not only that, it starts from the day before Pesach at midday when they were bringing the Paschal lamb. So why is this so necessary? Why can't we just have a party? And why, okay, if we're not going to eat bread or challah or cake, let's put it aside. We'll eat matzah. Why does it have to be that it is eliminated from our possession and we're not permitted to have it with us at all? We're not supposed to own it. We're supposed to eliminate it or get rid of it in which way. Today, of course, we do it through the sale of chametz, but we're not permitted to own it. So we're going to discuss that a little bit. And then one other thing that we need to know is that there is an obligation on the first night of Pesach and only on the first night to eat matzah. The difference between the first night and in diaspora, it's the first 2 nights to the rest of the holidays. The rest of the holiday, if you want to eat carbs other than potatoes, you can't eat bread, you eat matzah. But there's no commandment that you must eat matzah then. If you choose not to eat any matzah, it's also fine. Night of Pesach, for the Seder, you must eat matzah. What happens if you're gluten-free? today's time, they have figured out how to make gluten-free matzah. Excuse me. Now, there's two kinds of gluten-free matzah. There's gluten-free imitation matzah, which you do not fulfill your obligation on it, made of tapioca or some other starch, non-wheat starch. So you don't recite the hamotzi, so that's not considered matzah. The only gluten-free matzah that you can fulfill your obligation is on an oat matzah, which is gluten-free. And it's sold, it's a little bit more expensive. It's sold here in Charlotte, both at Chabad and also at Gleiberman's Kosher Gourmet. You'll find it there as well. So the idea is that that's mandatory, the idea of eating matzah. So what I want to do now, after we have now covered the fact of the importance that Pesach is the birthday of the Jewish people, and also is the holiday that the first mitzvot that were given to the Jewish people were given on Pesach, I'd like to see how the Code of Jewish Law enumerates it. I didn't prepare any papers because I'd rather just talk about it and it should be absorbed in our minds. Okay, so Maimonides and the sages after Maimonides enumerate 8 commandments which are biblical commandments. Now, why do I emphasize biblical commandments? Because, or authentically, I need to pause and explain that. From time to time, we have to understand what's the difference between a biblical commandment and a rabbinical commandment. It doesn't mean that a biblical is more important and a rabbinical is less important. They're equally important. And one cannot say, oh, this is a rabbinical, so therefore I can be lenient with it. No, a biblical commandment and a rabbinical commandment are both mandatory. The difference is that if you run into a doubt whether you observe the mitzvah or not, so you can be more lenient with the rabbinical and you have to be more strict with the biblical. So let's say on the night of Pesach, there's the biblical mitzvah to eat matzah, and there's the rabbinical mitzvah to eat maror, even though originally it was in the Torah. And you would say, hey, eating bitter herbs is a biblical mitzvah. It says clearly. And we recite a blessing on it. Blessed are you, God, just like we do a blessing on matzah. Blessed are you, God, the Lord of the universe, King of our Lord, the King of the universe, who has sanctified us with commandments and commanded us to eat matzah. We do the same thing. He commanded us to eat maror. Comes along Maimonides and says, actually, there's a difference between matzah and maror. Matzah is a standalone mitzvah. There is a mitzvah in the story of Passover that God says to Moshe, speak to the Jewish people that on the night of Passover, they must eat matzah. Then there is another mitzvah, and that's the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, of the Paschal offering, the Paschal lamb, that they had to eat on the night of Pesach. And it says as a condiment to the Paschal lamb, it's not enough that they eat the Paschal lamb. And the matzah, they have to add the bitter herbs. There's a reason why, because you have to remember the bitter days that you were in exile in Egypt. Says Maimonides, says the Rambam, since today we don't have the Paschal lamb, and we're not permitted to bring the Paschal lamb because the Paschal lamb can only be brought in the Holy Temple, and the Holy Temple is not in our possession, so therefore the biblical obligation for maror doesn't exist. So why do we eat maror? Sages have said that it shouldn't be forgotten from the Jewish people. Since it is mentioned in the Torah, we have to eat it. So therefore, maror is not a biblical mitzvah today, it's a rabbinical mitzvah. What's the difference between the two? Let's say you had too much wine. So you have to drink 4 cups of wine, which we'll cover soon. And after the 3rd cup, you don't remember if you did have matzah or maror. You're like totally forgetting. The wine is really, really strong. And you ask yourself, did I have the matzah? Did I have the maror? So if you have a doubt if you ate the matzah, you have to eat the matzah again. But if you had a doubt if you ate the maror, you don't have to eat it. Because one is rabbinic, one is biblical, and the other rabbinical. So this is the parauthentic part of the difference between the biblical and the rabbinical. So we're going to go over the biblical mitzvah, and there are 8. From the 8, there are 3 positive, which means 3 do's, and 3 don'ts. Okay? The first one is a don't, and that is not to eat chametz from Erev Pesach, which was the 14th of Nisan. From midday, it's prohibited to eat chametz at that point. Why? Biblical commandment doesn't say why. Well, how do we know that? We know that from the Torah, because the Torah says that from midday you can bring the Paschal lamb, and you cannot bring the Paschal lamb while you have chametz in your home. So from that, we know that from midday you can't have chametz. What's midday today? About one sages in the Talmud of Psachim have said that someone might get mixed up with the time. So therefore, they instituted 2 things. An hour before midday, which is at about 12:50, to make sure that by then all the chametz is eliminated. It means if you have any leftover, you burn it. And then 2 hours before that, which is about 11:07, 11:08, you should stop eating the chametz. And There's a whole debate whether both one has to be 2 hours, the other one has to be 1 hour. And some communities are accustomed that someone at the front door, you want to go get it? Coming! Don't come on time. I guess they rang the bell and we didn't hear it. Sorry, folks. We'll get onto it right away. Okay, so Stuart Cohen asks, why do we eat matzah 7 days and not one? I will explain that in a few minutes. That's very, very important. And actually, in the diaspora, we eat matzah 8 days. So I will explain it. That's from the... Okay. So again, the first thing is that we make sure that we don't have the chametz from before midday. Hi, no problem. As long as you're here, you can pull up another chair. Glad you're here. The second one is not only not to eat the chametz from midday, but also leva'er, to obliterate the chametz from existence from midday, which we do an hour before. Now, the Talmud goes into a whole discussion. What is the meaning of obliterating chametz? And here's where I want to stop and talk a little bit about it, because this is the basis. There's no question that the safest way to get rid of chametz, it's not in existence, is to burn it. And that is the traditional way that we do it. Any other way, if you throw it to the wind, somebody else might find it. Even if you put it in the water, it might come out. It depends what kind of chametz it is. So therefore, the best way is to burn it. Now, it's not expected that a person, if they have all these loaves of bread and all this cereal and crackers and all the other chametz, pasta and everything else that they have in their cupboards, that they should go and burn it on that day. So in the olden days, food was basically perishable, unless you had wheat. But otherwise, food was perishable. So people had food enough for a day or two, so therefore it wasn't a big problem to prepare yourself for Pesach. But what happens when people learned how to make food last longer on the shelf? So when you roll the wheat into a pasta and you put it into a box, you can have it on the shelf for 6 months. And it stays good. Or you make crackers or cereal, or all these things are considered chametz. So we find an interesting story in the Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud, where it says there were several sages that were on a ship traveling the Mediterranean Sea, and they were anticipating that they're going to be on the boat for. They had matzah with them, and they had whatever food they can eat. But they also had, one of them had sacks of wheat that were not kosher for Pesach. So before Pesach, he went over to one of the non-Jewish passengers and he asked, can you buy my wheat for me? And he said, sure. He bought it from him. And with that, he didn't have it in his possession. After Pesach, he went back to him and he said, do you really need it? He says, well, no. You want to sell it back to me? He had a choice whether to sell it back or not. He didn't need to sell it back. It wasn't a sale on the, on a whim, or it wasn't a sale with the intent that it should be bought back. It was a true sale. So that opens up the door to the concept of selling the chametz. And that, after years later, it became the tradition, actually, that the safest way, besides burning the symbolic chametz that you have left over, is besides consuming it, whatever is left in your covers, whatever has shelf life, that you sell it. And you sell it in a very special way. It's not recommended that you go to a non-Jewish neighbor and say, buy, not the way it's done. There's a whole process of how it has to be done. There has to be a guarantor and a factor. So we do it through the rabbis. I don't even sell the chametz. I do it with a rabbi in New York, since we're in the same time zone. So all the forms that I get, I will send over to him on Thursday. That he'll get it on Friday. And on Monday morning, he does the sale of the chametz, including my chametz as well. There were people at first that were against it because they said that since you buy it back, it's not a real sale. But the truth of the matter is that if you look at the contract, it's a real sale. I have two stories to bring that about. In Germany, about 800 years ago, there was someone that went to the monarchy and said to the king, the Jews are cheating you from sales tax because they sell this chametz, they buy it back, and they don't pay tax on it. They don't charge tax on it. And that's a crime. It's tax evasion. The king was a good-hearted man, so he said, let me research it. So he researched it, and he realized that it's a religious obligation for them to sell the chametz. So he comes out and he says it's just a ritual. It's not a real sale. So therefore they don't have to pay chametz. So the Jews came banging on the palace. No! We're ready to pay the taxes on it. We want it to be a real sale. Because it had to be a real sale. It's the only time you find people running and saying, we want to pay the taxes, because they wanted that they shouldn't violate the law. So that's one story. Second story happened with me here in Charlotte. There was a particular bagel factory, which is no longer in existence. That particular bagel factory was owned by a Jewish man, and he wanted to go kosher. So we worked out something with the Circle K, which he wanted the highest level. We got the Circle K, we did kosher. Everything was fine and dandy. We had to separate the challah and all the things that you have to do if a Jew owns bread, and everything was fine and dandy. About 3 weeks before, I got a big FedEx package. This is before faxes and everything. No, it was before, internet the way it is today. And they tell me, okay, go to this guy and tell him that if he wants to remain kosher, he has to sell his chametz, sell the bakery. I said, okay, I knew what it was, but it was a big packet with legal documents. So I come to him and I said, yeah, you want to be kosher? He said, yes. Well, I said, you as a Jew cannot own chametz and you have to shut down the bakery and all of that. He knew he had to shut down the bakery, that he had knowledge. But sell, he says, let me see. He looks at the contract, goes page after page after page, and he turns white like a sheet. And he says to me, Rabbi, I am not going to sell my life's work just to keep a Jewish ritual. Are you crazy? No deal. This is real. I'm selling my bakery and my assets and everything else. And you don't even make a price with me. No, I can't do this. So I said to him, fine, no one is going to force you to sell it. You can keep the bakery. You can keep the chametz. You know what? The kosher symbol is going to go off your bagel, and that's it. And that's your choice. So he says, let me think about it. He calls me back a few hours later and he says, okay, I'm ready to do it. So I come back to his office and I said, what made you change your mind? He says, I spoke to some Jewish friends that own bagel factories in New York. And when they heard it, they started to laugh and they said, we all do it every year. Why should you be different? So he says, does it mean that the rabbi can walk away the bakery? They said, absolutely yes. But he won't. But it's a real sale legally. So when we say the selling of the chametz, it's not just a ritual or it's not some sort of trick or some sort of gimmick. It's real. It's not symbolic and it would stand up in court. And the non-Jew that we sell the chametz, if he's driving down from New York to Florida, he has our addresses. He can legally stop by, knock on the door and say, folks, I want to have my cereal, my crackers, it all belongs to me. And that's 100%. Some people even hand the key to their homes and to their cupboards so that he should have access to it. I'm not going that far. So that's another way. Yes, not to my knowledge. Usually they buy it back. And you have to remember that when you're dealing with non-Jewish people that live in very large Jewish communities, they have an understanding of it and a respect for it. So I've never seen, but legally, if they don't want to sell it back, it's theirs. And you have to deliver it to them. They sold all of their chametz, yes. If they're kosher, if they have a kosher supervision, yes. Every kosher bakery, every kosher deli, absolutely yes. No, they just lock down the premises. Exactly. 100%. And if they don't do it, then you can't buy food from them anymore until the next cycle. In other words, when they get new flour and new material. This was a problem when they had a Jewish-owned supermarket chain in New York called Waldbaum. So people were worried, but at the end, they found out it was a publicly owned company, and a publicly owned company, it doesn't apply. Okay. So today we do two things in order to eliminate the chametz. Number one is that we sell, and number two, whatever we have left over, which is very little, we burn. But we actually have a ceremony burning the chametz. Okay, biblical. Mitzvah number 3, chametz that we own cannot be seen in our possession. We cannot even see chametz. You can see chametz that doesn't belong to you. So when you sell the chametz, usually when you sell the chametz, you're selling the pots and pans and the chametz. What we usually do is we put a piece of tape on all those cupboards so nobody opens it by mistake. But if somebody opens it and you see it, you haven't violated because it's not yours. It belongs to someone else. The prohibition is against yours. So it means if you're walking into a mall and you're walking by a bakery, it doesn't mean you have to close your eyes because it's not yours, but yours you're not allowed to see. Second is that you're not allowed to have it in your possession even if you don't see it. Your chametz. In other words, you're not allowed to own it. In fact, there's a big discussion in the Code of Jewish Law. If somebody forgot and they didn't sell their chametz, they thought they had none of it, and all of a sudden they find, it happened to someone that I know many years ago, a young couple, they just got married, they didn't buy any food. So they didn't, I don't know if they sold their chametz, but they didn't have any. And all of a sudden they looked in one of their freezers and they forgot they had put a loaf of bread in it. So they were very upset. But then they found out that they actually did sell it, even though they didn't understand what they were doing at the time, but it was a legal sale. They thought it was a ritual. But that's what you have to be careful. The fifth mitzvah, so we have 1, 2, 3. Now is the fourth negative. The positive is to eliminate the chametz. The fifth mitzvah is not to consume or eat chametz all of the 7 days. And the sixth goes with it, that one is not permitted even to eat anything that has a mixture of chametz in it. And this is very important because sometimes you buy foods or packaged food or processed foods, and it may seem pure food and you don't realize that it has a wheat substance in it, which makes it chametz. The seventh mitzvah is to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach. Now in Israel, where they celebrate Passover the way they did in the original times, which is 7 days, the first day of Passover is a sanctified day, there's a holy day, and the last day is a holy day, which is the 7th day. So they only have one Seder, the first night. In the diaspora, we have a repeat of the first Seder. So for us, it's a mitzvah to eat both nights, the first and second. For them, it's only the first night. The rest of Pesach, it's not a mitzvah to eat matzah. If somebody decides to go carb-free, they don't want to eat any carbs, or they just might have a potato instead of anything else, that's fine. They don't have to eat matzah. Even though on Shabbat, it's nice to have 2 matzahs, but they decide not to. They're not violating a biblical obligation. When it says 7 days you shall eat matzah, it means to say that in lieu of bread, you should eat matzah, but it doesn't mean that you have to eat matzah. It's not the same thing. And there's a whole way that the Talmud learns it, but that's not really relevant right now. What's more relevant is that it's not a mitzvah to eat matzah the rest of the week. Only the first night is it truly a mitzvah. How much matzah do you have to eat? What? There is a requirement. And actually our requirement is to eat 2 measurements of olives, which basically, if you look at a shmura matzah, it's a little over half of each. Now, when you have the Seder plate, so it's not just on the Seder plate that you have the shank bone and the egg and the bitter herbs. You have 3 matzahs, one on top of the other. And there's a reason why there are many reasons, but one of that is because what you have to eat. So when you eat the matzah after reciting the blessing, you have to eat a little over half of the top matzah and a little over half of the middle matzah. A lot of matzah. And you have to eat it pretty much consecutively so that you fulfill the mitzvah of eating the matzah. Very important. The third matzah on the bottom is really for the wrap or the sandwich. And then there's the afikomen that we eat later. But the main requirement is to eat that. Now, of course, if someone has a very hard time, at least they have a little bit of it. One doesn't have to force themselves to the point where they're in pain, but people would do that. Especially when it came to wine. The Talmud says there was one particular rabbi that he couldn't tolerate wine. And he used to drink the wine for the 4 cups. And until Rosh Hashanah, he had stomach maladies from the wine that he drank, but he never gave up on it. This was for him, every year he did it. This is the time of the Talmud. Okay, so we have now the 8th mitzvah. What is the 8th mitzvah? The 8th mitzvah is to recite the story of Passover, to tell the story of Passover. And that is by reciting the Haggadah. The Haggadah tells you the story of Passover. The organization of the Haggadah will speak in a few minutes, but the idea of the Haggadah, the word Haggadah means to relate, and to relate the story of Passover, the way it is written in the Haggadah, is also a biblical commandment. So it's not enough just to eat the foods. The Haggadah has to be read as well. So there you have the biblical mitzvah. Then you also have rabbinical mitzvah. Now, can we think of a rabbinical mitzvah? I already mentioned before the eating of the bitter herbs. But then there's another rabbinical mitzvah, which is quite important, and that is the drinking of 4 cups of wine. For children or people that cannot tolerate wine, they can drink grape juice. But if you can drink wine, you must drink wine. That's a rabbinic requirement. There are reasons for it. There are 4 cups, which we'll talk about in a minute, but this is a mitzvah. Now, the kiddush is considered the first cup. For that reason, unlike all other nights, all other Friday nights or holidays, when you have the leader of the group reciting the Kiddush over the cup of wine, and everybody has a little. On the night of Passover, everybody has a Kiddush cup or a glass, Everybody's cup is filled to the rim, and everybody is reciting Kiddush together, and everyone is drinking the full cup of wine. What? So how many ounces is minimum is 3 ounces. That's not a lot. However, there's a trick here. I remember when I was a kid, we had this businessman in real estate, but he was a jester. And he said there was once a Jewish man called to the king, and he showed him a mound of sand. And he said, how many pails will it take to remove that mound? So the Jewish man was very quick on his feet, and he says, it depends on the size of the pail. If the size of the pail is the size of half of the mound, all you need is 2. So where are we going with that? It says you must drink 4 cups of wine. Oh, and a cup has to be a minimum of 3.4 ounces. It's better to have a cup that's small, that has exactly 3.4, 3.6, and drink the full cup, than have a larger cup. Because unlike Friday night, that if even you drink a little bit more than half, you fulfill the obligation, the night of Pesach, you have to drink the entire cup of wine. So therefore, the Kiddush cups for Pesach should, if you cannot tolerate wine, should be smaller. If you like a lot of wine, then you can have as big as Elijah's cup. That just depends how much and how dizzy you want to get. This is the thing. It has to be the full cup. People that just take a sip and a lick and a little, they don't fulfill the obligation. So you need to have the full cup of wine. So that's the rabbinical mitzvah. Another thing in the rabbinical mitzvah I said is the Gemara. Now, the other things by the Seder we'll discuss soon, because those are all rabbinical, but this is basically how the breakup is of the biblical and the rabbinical mitzvahs. Now, I want to go back a little bit. Some of the other rabbinical commandments that grace the holiday of Passover. One of them is the search for chametz, which is done the night before, and the sages said the best thing is to have a candle, feather, and a wooden spoon that you can collect it. Yes, that was the way to be done today, so symbolically people do it today. I have to say that if somebody waits to have their house cleaned on the night before Pesach, they're way behind. By the time one searches the chametz, they have to know that there is no chametz except in a designated area, and they go around searching symbolically, so much so that the sages were worried that if you're not going to find any chametz, you're saying the blessing in vain. Therefore, they instituted that you hide 10 little pieces very well wrapped up in different parts of the house, that when you search, you will find that. Now, one of the ways to know if you truly search is if you have kids in the house, that could be your kids or grandkids or neighbors' kids, whoever's kids, you give them the task of hiding the 10 pieces. You don't know where it is. Then when you finish searching, you will know, and they will know whether you truly went through the entire house or you just did it symbolically. So the idea is you got to search for the chametz. So that's the idea of searching of the chametz is part of the eliminated. There is no other prohibition in the Torah, biblically, that's like chametz for many reasons. Number one, even if someone has non-kosher food, they're allowed to have it in their house as long as they're not going to eat it. It's just that they have to protect themselves that they shouldn't eat it. Chametz, you're not only not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to have it. Secondly, if something non-kosher falls into a kosher pot, you measure 60 against it, and then it's kosher. Pesach, even if a tiny bit falls in, everything's not kosher. That's why we're so careful. We're so crazy careful that it shouldn't come to that kind of being that we don't want to have the chametz. Another thing about it, that chametz the rest of the year is permissible. It's desirable. And yet on Pesach, it's not. Something which people can't understand. So the question is, why? Why is chametz something that God has prohibited? I have to say from the outset, we don't know. But there is something symbolic. And that is, as I said before, Pesach is the birthday. And we start a connection with God. And the only way we can do it is through humility. Matzah is called the poor man's bread. It's flat, has holes in it. It's humble. Chametz rises. A lot of hot air. It's pompous. It's haughty. So, which is the beginning of our service to Hashem. We're not yet ready to deal with chametz. We can only deal with. But as we go on, we're learning how to refine the chametz so much so that after the 7 weeks, when we count the Omer on Shavuot, which was the culmination of Pesach, 7 weeks later, we had to eat chametz because by then the chametz could be refined. Okay, so that's one of the reasons. You know that chametz and matzah in Hebrew is spelled almost identically, except matzah is with a hey and chametz is with a chet. And chet and a hey also look very similar. The difference with the chet and a hey is The hay has an opening like a window, and the chet is totally closed. What's the difference between a window and totally closed? A window allows you to see the outside and connect. Totally closed makes a person self-centered. As the famous story of a rabbi that came to a town and he saw that there was a hospitable couple. They had this big house. They weren't very wealthy, but they always hosted people. They had people eating and sleeping with them, and they were constantly taking care of the needs of the poor. The rabbi was so excited they gave them a blessing with immense wealth. Years later, he came back to the town, and he couldn't find their house. So he asked people, where's the house? So they said, they moved a few acres away. You have to go through these gardens and these paths, trails, until you come to their house. And he walked through these beautiful orchards, and then he sees this magnificent palace. He says, my blessing was fulfilled. And he knocks on the door, and a butler opens up, and he says, who are you? My master has no time for pests like you. Scam, get away. I'm not here to ask for anything. Just need to see him. The butler got very angry, and in the commotion, the owner of the house came down his elegant stairs, and he sees it's none other than the rabbi who blessed him. And he says to the butler, move aside. If not for him, I would not have this immense wealth. And he says, Rabbi, I can't thank you enough because you've changed my life. And the rabbi says, oh, good. And he's trying to see where all the poor people are. Last time he remembers the kitchen was busy and the dining room was full of people and the bedrooms had people resting. And the man gives him a tour and it's all empty. One room is nicer than the other with crystal and gold and chandelier. Till he comes upstairs, great room with a big mirror. And all you can see is yourself. We're the poor people. The rabbi realized. He takes the man over to the window. The window was pretty high, but overlooked the trees. He looks at the market, and he says to him, so what do you see? He says, I see Beryl the beggar asking for money. I see Shmerel the baker trying to sell some loaves of bread. I see Rivkala running as a tailor's wife trying to earn a few cupcakes. Takes him back to the room, looks in the mirror. Says, what do you see? He says, I see myself and my magnificent wall. The rabbi says, I don't understand. The window is glass and the mirror is glass. Yet when it comes to the window, you can see everybody. But when it comes to the mirror, all you can see is yourself and your own wealth. Rabbi, don't you understand? The mirror has silver. He says, And he takes out a pocket knife and he says, if I take away the silver, then you would begin to see everybody else. And the man realized what happened. And he said, no. From now it's changed. And he sent out his butler, call all the old people, call all the poor people and all of that. But this is the difference between a chet and a hay. A chet is without the window, just focusing on yourself. That's the matzah. With the hay is humble. And with humility, you can actually see other people and you can appreciate them. So that's the idea of matzah. That's why matzah is also called bread of affliction. It's a poor man's bread. And we remember the suffering of the people. Okay, so this gives you a little introduction to the laws of Pesach and also to the essence of Pesach. A few more things and we go back to the laws of Pesach. It says that Pesach is the time of our liberation, our time of freedom. In fact, when we read the Haggadah, we say, we were slaves to Pharaoh, and if God wouldn't have had Pesach, we and our children and children's children would have still been enslaved. So what's the meaning of that? Excuse me. What's the meaning of that? So it's very hard for us to imagine this, but in the olden days, the status of a person was determined by their birth or their bad luck. Someone was born a slave, it was meant that they're doomed to slavery forever and ever and ever. Their kids and their children's kids, they couldn't live as free people. If someone was in captivity and put in a slavery, they also remained a slave. They were finished. A slave was a subhuman. Slave was not only someone that served the master and worked hard, their whole existence was there to ingratiate and build the master, even on to death. That's what a slave was. So we read the horror stories about slavery. Egypt perfected it because they really enslaved the Hebrews and made them work to their death, building all the pyramids, building all of the fortresses, and the plight of the Jews was very difficult. How long were the Jews in slavery? 10 years. When you think about 210 years, how old is this country? Not 300 years yet. So we remember the 20th bicentennial, okay? 200 years is lots of lifetimes. So you're talking about people that were born into slavery, third, fourth, fifth generation. They didn't know what it means to be free. They never tasted freedom. And here comes along God and says, you were created in the divine image. You have a part of God. you're truly a free person. You truly have a soul that can soar, and nobody can dominate you except me, except God. You can connect to me, you will be free. And that's where he wanted to break the spell of slavery. And that's there were the 10 plagues. Each of the plagues broke the grasp and the concept of slavery to understand that there's a higher power. That's the power of Hashem. And that's why the night of Pesach is so important, because A, it celebrates our birthday, but B, it celebrates the divine concept that's in the human being a free person. And that's why Pesach is so essential. It's such an important holiday. Yes. The question is if it's okay to substitute grape juice for wine. We said in the beginning of the class, yes, if it's difficult for a person to drink wine, they can definitely drink grape juice. And I'll get back to you as well. Grape juice, it actually says on many of the bottles of grape juice when I was growing up, it is proper kosher for Kiddush and for the 4 cups. Now, if somebody can drink wine, it's better for them to drink wine. But if they can't, grape juice is perfectly fine. Okay, what's the 400 years and the 210 years? So it says that God told Abraham that his children will be in a strange foreign land and they will be oppressed for 400 years. But it doesn't say that they will be slaves for that long. If you calculate from the time of Yitzhak, which was Abraham's son, from when he was born till the Exodus, it was 400 years. But if you calculate the time from when after Joseph passed away and Pharaoh took over, it's 210 years. And whether it was because God in his mercy wanted to minimize it or it was intentionally that way, we don't know. But we do know that the 400 years goes from the time of Isaac and it was actually 210, which 210 was enough misery. You know, we're thinking about the hostages. The hostages have been in captivity for over 6 months. It's unimaginable what they're going through. It's unimaginable when someone's in captivity a year or two. But think about families and families for 210 years. It's beyond our. So that's why it's another law on Pesach, and that is that when we eat, except when we eat the maror, we're supposed to be in a relaxed way. Now, in the olden days, when a prince would want to eat, they didn't sit by a dining room table. When a prince wanted to eat, they had this like couch chair where they would relax, and they had these little tables that their servants would bring over to them. They would just lean over it to their delight. When they were finished, they would snap their finger, the table was put away. There was another course, another table was brought to them. That was the sign of relaxation, mastery of control. So therefore, the sages instituted that on the night of Pesach, in order to that we're free, we are in a relaxed fashion. It's a little hard to eat in a relaxed fashion. I don't know how well people do eating in bed or eating on a couch. Usually ask our kids. They're the real free people. Our kids are the true, independent, redeemed people. No masters over them. Anyways, okay. So we have a little bit of a picture of what the prep for Pesach is and the main mitzvah of Pesach. Now I want to go a little bit to the Seder because that's sort of the foundation of the night of Pesach. So the first Seder was actually conducted in Egypt while the Jews were still in slavery, but they were not totally enslaved. They already experienced some of the freedom. They were told to eat matzah, and they were told to ask to have the Paschal lamb. The matzah that they ate that night was because they were commanded to eat the matzah. Then there was another matzah which came later, and that was when they were running away after Pharaoh told them to leave, that they didn't allow the bread to rise. So it's 2 different kinds of matzahs. They're both matzah, but they have 2 different meanings. And it's represented by the matzah that we eat in the beginning of the night and the matzah that we eat on the afikomen. Because the afikomen is the matzah that's associated with the Paschal lamb. So the first Seder was actually in Egypt. And just imagine, they had to take a lamb because that was the main part of the Seder night. The Medrash says that the lamb was considered to be a deity to the Egyptians. We still have cultures that worship animals. You see that in India. And they actually worship the lamb. God says to Moshe 2 weeks before Pesach that 4 days before Pesach, every Jewish family should draw to them a lamb and bring it into their house. Put a leash on it, and it should be next to their bed so that 4 days later it could be brought as an offering. Why the 4 days? There are many reasons. But one of the things we do know is that the Egyptians were saying, why are you taking our deity to your house? And the Jewish people responded, because in 4 days we're going to have the major miracle that we're going to be redeemed and we're going to eat the lamb as an offering for God. Now, the Egyptians did not doubt the Israelites because the first 9 warnings that Moshe gave all were fulfilled. So they knew that this will also be fulfilled. Not only that, Jews said that Moses told us that the firstborn of every Egyptian family will die on this night. Well, when word got out to the firstborn, they rioted and it became a civil war. And that distracted them from the Israelites. That was considered to be a miracle. It was on the Shabbat before Pesach. And for that reason, every year, the Shabbat before Pesach was called the Big Shabbat because of the great miracle that happened on that Shabbat. Now, one other thing that the sages always try to make us remember is the following. And this actually is quite important. Why were the Israel firstborn spared and the Egyptian ones were killed? Obviously, because the Egyptians were the oppressors and the Jews were the victims. However, if you dig deeper, you find that there were many Jewish people that actually emulated the Egyptians and were like them. And they envied the Egyptians. They worshipped idols just like the Egyptians. And why did they not? Some of them did, some of them did not. In fact, it says that one of the reasons why there was a plague of darkness is that the Egyptians shouldn't see the death of the Israelites that died at that time and were buried because they weren't worthy of going out in the night. So this triggers a thought that the death of the firstborn could have been us as well. And for that reason, the sages instituted that on the day before Pesach, the firstborn Jews, anyone that's a firstborn, should fast as a day of tshuva, a day of self-reflection. And it's called the fast of the firstborn. It starts before sunrise and it ends at nightfall. However, there's a little problem. Every fast in Judaism like that, they copied us. We don't. No, absolutely not. Most of our fasts are from before sunrise to nightfall. There are only 2 fasts that are 24 hours, 25 hours. Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. All the other fasts, not at night. The sages say clearly that you can eat at night up until the morning star, which this is usually about an hour and a half or 2 hours before sunrise. And if you eat all night before that period of time, it's considered fasting if you don't eat the rest of the day. That's a separate discussion that a lot of things were emulated from Judaism. Now, the problem that I want to mention is that it's not advisable to come into the Seder fasting. Several reasons. Number one, you're going to be drinking 4 cups of wine. And if you fast and drink 4 cups of wine, it's not going to play out well. Secondly, you have to eat all that matzah on an unsettled stomach, and you have to eat all that maror. Therefore, the sages have said it's preferable for the firstborn to partake in a feast of mitzvah. And the feast of mitzvah overrides the fast because it's not a biblical fast. It's a custom. Now, you can't always schedule a feast of mitzvah like a brit or a bar mitzvah or a pinyan haben. So for that reason, it says that if you conclude a tractate or you partake in a ceremony where a tractate of the Talmud is concluded, and then you eat, that's considered a feast of mitzvah. That's why in every synagogue on the morning before Passover, at the conclusion of the service, either the rabbi or someone in the congregation concludes a tractate, which we will be doing here on Monday morning, and then all the firstborn can eat. But that's where the custom is in regards to the fast of the firstborn. So that's something which takes up space in Jewish. Secondly, the day before Passover is considered to be a minor holiday, and that's why after midday, unless work has to get done, it's better just to do prep for Pesach, not just do leisurely stuff or things that you don't have to do, and say, oh, I can, work, have a few hours until Passover. It's better not, because it's considered to be a holiday. That's another important thing about the Pesach holiday. So what we covered all the mitzvot. We covered the fact that the night before Pesach, you have to search for the hummus. The morning, you have to burn it. You have to stop eating. Now, one other thing that we have to remember, and that is that on the eve of Pesach, we are not permitted to eat matzah, right? You know that. So you can eat everything else. That's not common. You can have potatoes, you can have meat, you can have fish, you can have dairy, you can have cheese, whatever is kosher for Passover. You can even eat macaroons if you want, but you cannot eat matzah until the night. That's universal. Some people have the custom that they don't eat matzah for a month before Pesach to build up an appetite. But on the day before Pesach, that is a given that we don't. So you go into Pesach with an appetite for matzah. Another thing that we have to know is there is no other food in today's times that eating it is considered to be a mitzvah, and that it's universal for everybody, even in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. There's no food that the eating of the food is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to eat on Shabbat, but it's not a particular food. There's no mitzvah. And how do we know that? The very fact that we have a blessing dedicated for the eating of matzah. We say, blessed are you, God our Lord, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to eat matzah. So the eating of the matzah becomes a mitzvah. The matzah actually becomes the mitzvah. And you're eating the matzah, you're eating the mitzvah. There's no other mitzvah like that. And that's why matzah is most precious of all. Now let's talk about matzah for a moment as well. Matzah, as you know, cannot be leavened. How long does it take for a mixture of flour and water to become leavened? 18 minutes. So if you mixed it and you knead it, and then you let it sit, even if it didn't rise, but it started to ferment a little bit, it's considered chametz. So in the matzah bakery, they have a clock with an alarm, and every 18 minutes the bakery shuts down. Now, usually there's more than one dough in 18 minutes. It usually takes from the time that the water hits the flour till it comes out as a baked product is usually 3 to 4 minutes. That's how quick they are. This is not even in an automated machine matzah factory. I'm talking about the hand. And the hand matzah is called shmura matzah. Called shmura because it's guarded from the time that the wheat is cut until it comes out as a final product. The wheat is cut in a very special way, and it's ground in a milled in a special way. It's stored in a special way. The water that they use for it is also stored in a special way. It's all inspected that there's no foreign additives to it, and there's nothing in it except the purity of it. And then they make the matzah. But if it's more than 18 minutes, it's leavened. For that reason, people that buy boxed matzah for Passover at the supermarket need to make sure that it says on the matzah, kosher for Passover. Because believe it or not, there's matzah sold and it says not for Passover use. A lot of people like to eat matzah because why? That bakery that baked not for Passover, which could be the same Passover bakery, but they do it all year round. There's no reason for them to shut down every 18 minutes. What happens when they shut down every 18 minutes? When the bakery shuts down, it goes through a thorough cleansing. Everything is washed down, cleansed, sanded down, that not a drop of dough remains on the equipment, on the machinery, or if it's handmade, then on the hand-baked equipment. Even the rolling pins are sanded down every 18 minutes, and then they're wiped and cleaned with sandpaper. They're literally sanded down, so there should be nothing left on it. The pans are washed and cleansed. The machine that they use to make the holes is burnt out with a torch, so it starts again because of the 18 minutes. I remember one time at the bakery, it was the fourth dough that they were able to get, but some of the matzahs made it into the oven at 18 minutes. And the mashgiach came, took all of it, dumped it in the garbage after 18 minutes. So that's why it has to be very, very careful. Usually they shut down the bakery before 18 minutes so you don't have the overrun, but by 17 minutes, they usually shut it down. So this is another important thing about matzah. What? Strikes? I know what you're talking about. So if it's for Pesach, yeah, they're automated. So when you talk about the machine-made matzah today, everything is computerized. We don't eat machine matzah on Pesach. We only eat hand-made matzah because it's a tradition. But the machine-made matzah today, everything is automated. So every 18 minutes, the matzah is already baked, the machine stops, and they have automatic cleansers that come and clean out the entire equipment thoroughly, and then it starts up again. Passover matzah is more expensive than non-Passover because the downtime that it takes and the labor that is involved in cleaning and supervising it to make sure that it's done. Another difference between matzah and challah is that when you bake challah, you have to separate the dough and put away aside, and we burn it. With matzah, you don't separate the dough. After you bake the matzah, then they cut a piece off because there's no time to wait for the dough. Everything happens you could watch videos on Google, handmade shmura matzah, and you can see videos today of how they do it. It is awfully quick. Very, very quick. As I say, It can take between 3-4 minutes from the water hits the flour till when it comes out as a final product. That's how quick it happens. It's just amazing. The ovens that they use are brick ovens that are heated to 7, 8, or 900 degrees. And when the matzah goes into the brick oven, it doesn't take more than 30 to 40 seconds until it's done, and then it has to be taken out. The automated ones go through a conveyor belt, but I'm talking about the handmade. And that is the hardest job. The two hardest job is the kneader that has to knead, but the hardest job, the most difficult one, is standing in front of an oven that's 900 degrees all day and constantly putting in the rolling thing with the matzah and then pulling it out, putting it in, pulling it out, and then managing to make sure that none of it gets burnt. And usually that was the highest paid worker in the bakery because of the hard work. And the most of them that did it were Russians. They're made out of steel and they can tolerate anything, and they are very strong, and we can do it. We can do it. We'll do it. And they're muscular people and they're constantly doing it. So that's the story with the matzah. Any questions? Because I'm almost done. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
How about serving lamb?
I'll repeat the question for everybody. So about eating lamb on the night of Pesach, not the rest of Pesach. So there's several things. Chabad doesn't eat lamb on the night of Pesach. We don't even have the shank bone from a lamb on the Seder plate. We have a chicken neck. That's the Chabad custom. And the reason for that is because you don't want to give the impression that this is the Paschal lamb. Okay. Number 2, we don't eat roasted meat. When I say roast, we eat roast, but that's pot roast. But roast on the fire the way it was roasted in the time of the temple. In an open pit, we don't eat that on the night of Passover, not to emulate that. Why is that? There's a prohibition against eating holy food outside of Jerusalem. So in the time when the temple stood, they would all come to Jerusalem and they would have their seders in Jerusalem, those that ate the Paschal lamb. And they would bring the Paschal lamb as an offering there, then they would bring it back to wherever they stayed and they would have their seder. But they weren't allowed to take it outside of Jerusalem. It's called eating holy food outside of the perimeter. So we don't want to make something holy or give the impression if it's holy and then not eating it. This is an interesting controversy because every year you'll read in the paper that there's a group of these people in Jerusalem that they come with a lamb to the Temple Mount and they're ready to do the service and they're blocked by the Israeli police so that they shouldn't do it. It's always those people that say, now that Jerusalem is in our hands, we can bring the Paschal lamb. But it's so we don't eat lamb on the first night. You can eat lamb any other time at Passover, but we don't eat it on the first night. That's our custom. I'm not a lamb fan, so what?
Right.
I was in Israel a week and a half ago on Friday night. They gave a choice of chicken or lamb, and some of us said, we don't always eat lamb, and I regretted it. So I didn't really eat it, and it was a very good restaurant or a good hotel.
In the plastic bag, you're in your
I never was a lamb fan. What should I tell you? It's not. That's just for me. The gamey part, the sticky part. It's just whatever. It's not mine. Yes. What's the question? Okay. So the question is, they went out with 600,000 people. Actually, they went out with more than 600,000 people. There were probably about 2 million plus that went out of Egypt. And one of the things that it says in the book of Exodus in the beginning is that every Jewish mother had multiple births. And in some cases, they gave birth to 6 children at a time. One of the things that it says clearly is that they were blessed with lots and lots of children. They multiplied very, very quickly. Now, the other thing was they weren't 210 years in Egypt. They were in Egypt longer than that. They were enslaved for 210 years. No, actually, they were in Egypt 210 years. But they really multiplied a lot. Yeah. Even today, in some Jewish families, the birth rate is very, very high. If you think about family having 12 children, the next generation, they have 10 children. So a couple can have 100 grandchildren and 1,000 great-grandchildren. And 10, the math is there. It could even happen today. And it does happen today. It says 600,000 males. So 600,000 males, you have to assume there were 600,000 females. And then that's all from 20 to 60. Then you have to think about the young people that were there, those that were over 60. That's what I'm saying, probably too. But you're right. It says 600,000. 1,000 people that were eligible for the military. That's basically what it means. So that's why it says. Any more questions? Because we have to close it up soon. Why did it take 210? There must be a mystical reason for it. But it was not until the later years that God decided to take them out. Because the question is, why were they even enslaved in the first place? We don't understand the ways of God, but God himself said that the slavery was a way of refinement to make them sensitive to the needs of others. That when they suffered, they will understand how to deal with the suffering of everything that's associated with Egypt was a sense of refinement, refining themselves. And even after they went out of Egypt, it was a continuation of refinement. And they weren't yet ready even to receive the Torah until 7 weeks later. But God himself says you went through the metal refinery. It's called the Kur HaBarzel, the metal refinery. What happens in a refinery? It separates the good from the bad. It separates the pure from the impure. And it says that during that time, it was the true test of them overcoming their inclinations, overcoming their temptations, and recognizing what life really was. So we don't know why God did it, but it was a preparation for the eventual great liberation and the receiving of the Torah. I was once reading a health book that says, no pain, no gain, right? And they said the story of the Exodus is the impetus for this concept of no pain, no gain. Everybody knows that whatever happened while they were in the land of Egypt, enslaved, made them into better people. Now, we're not asking God to do this again. We've gone through enough. But the point of the matter is the way of refinement. It was also understanding what it means to respect the preciousness of life. It also made them understand the preciousness of their homeland and how to treat strangers. Many times in the Torah, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe says you should take care of the poor, you should take care of those that are have-nots. Remember that you too were a slave in Egypt. Also respect the foreigners that are in your midst, because you too were a slave in Egypt and you were a foreigner. So it was all a form of... we didn't go through the whole Seder because we didn't have time. That would require a separate thing. But I do want to say that the Seder is not just symbolic. The Seder is a process of self-refinement. It starts with Kaddish, which is the holiness, sanctifying oneself and then washing oneself. And it goes from one level to the other level until we say the praise of God. And then we conclude with the ultimate prayer, and that is L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. May the coming year be the year that we are all free and reunited in the holy city of Jerusalem. This year especially, since October 7th, when we celebrate the holiday of Pesach, many of us, our minds will be focused on the suffering of the hostages and the families that lost loved ones and the fear of war that's encompassing the people of Israel. And we will be praying for their ultimate freedom and their ultimate redemption. And may that happen immediately. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you, and just to be a happy and a kosher Pesach. And thanks to those that joined on the Zoom.